I got to say, I'm fairly impressed with how many of you are here. I thought it would be kumbaya in the front row this week. So thanks for venturing out. I had several interactions this week again that, for me, were just this reminder of the astounding community of people that you all are. And man, it's sure great being in the church with you. So thanks for coming out on such a cold morning. Those of you may also be interested to know, so some of you have been asking when's the next Ecuador trip, which, there's some work that we've been doing down there with this really neat lady named Noreen who helped start this organization, Families with Heart. My wife left to go down there to scout out for the next trip on Wednesday, and the story bears repeating. She was 4 hours late because the door fell off the plane. So apparently they were loading up, and when they went to close the door just fell off. And then when the plane finally took off, a huge snowstorm hit Minneapolis, so they diverted to Omaha, Nebraska. So my wife, I'm laughing because I think this is hilarious, because she always makes fun of me because I planned for everything. And she said to me when she left, hey, when you come to pick me up, bring my coat, because I'm not bringing a coat. And I'm like, dude, your coat weighs like 8 ounces. Bring a coat. So she spent the day and the evening and the night in Omaha, Nebraska without a coat, which I think is kind of funny. And then she flew out to Atlanta the next day, and now she's in Ecuador doing the crazy stuff that her and Nareem do. She's going to actually speak probably in September or October and start talking about the next trip that'll happen in the summer of 2020. Wow, that's kind of weird to think about. So here's where I want to start this morning is who is the person in your past that saw things in you that you didn't see in you? Who's the teacher, who's the coach, who's the first boss, who's the friend's parent, who's the person who saw you, maybe even liked you in ways that you didn't know you were capable of being liked. They saw things in you, they drew stuff out of you that you kind of look back and you go, I don't know if I would ever discovered that were it not for them. I mean, maybe you wouldn't be in the field that you're in. Maybe your life would have went a completely different path because they kind of pulled you out of some decisions you were making. Who's that person? Who's the coach? Who's the teacher? Who's the youth worker? Who's the parent's friend? Who's the first boss? Got somebody? I think it's valuable to think in terms of that because we're going to do some image of God stuff here, but I think that image can help us get started. For me, who comes to mind is a guy named Chris White. Chris, when I was 17, after we finished up the baseball season, I decided I wanted to get a job. I lived in Laurel, and I knew not to get a job in Laurel because if you got a job in Laurel, then that means you had a job where 10 other high school kids had a job, so every time you wanted a day off, you wouldn't get it off. So I went to Billings and got a job at this grocery store that my grandpa and grandma worked at. It was Albertsons. And Chris was one of those 80-hour-a-week, hard-charging, kind of trying to get his own store, second-in-command type of leaders. He conducted my interview because he was in a transition himself when I interviewed. And then I still remember I showed up for my first day at work, and I had the classic 90s haircut where it was shaved underneath and then long on top, especially, like it was a baseball thing, because then you looked respectable with the baseball hat on, and then you looked unrespectable with your hat off. That you know how that works. I still actually remember anyway. So I showed up to work, and I interviewed with a hat on, apparently, because I still remember my first day at work. I remember him looking at me going, dude, your hair. And so he made me put it in a ponytail, and I hated putting my hair in a ponytail. And then he gave me the 6-month probation lecture, which the first time you hear that lecture, you're convinced you're losing your job the next day, right? And so I remember losing sleep, having nightmares about begging people's groceries incorrectly. Chris and I kind of got off to a bad start, and so I was terrified of Chris, and he was this hard-charging, motivated, kind of stern guy who, like every can of the Campbell soup, faced a certain direction. I mean, his stores were immaculate. And then around my 18th birthday, I remember Chris approaching me and saying, hey, so we're going to start training you as a checker, which in the grand world of things is no big deal. But when you're 18 years old, working your first job and a high school kid, that was quite the compliment. And actually, you'll be surprised by this, I loved the task nature of checking groceries, especially the express line. I just loved, how fast can I get these people through this line? And the old people who worked there, no offense, they hated the express line. So it was like, you take the express line. And then there was the muscular dystrophy drive. When they sell would you like to donate $1 to muscular dystrophy? Well, I was told it was a contest, and for whatever reason, I'm usually not that guy. For whatever reason, I was like, I'm going to win this contest. So I was selling these little shamrock things that people would write their name on, and I still remember the day where I showed up to work, and I was walking through the back room, senior in high school, view of myself was very low, decisions over the last 3 years of my life, very terrible, hair very long. Not that necessarily correlates, but it was correlating for me. And I remember Chris approaching me and going, hey, you won the competition. And I don't actually remember exactly what he said. I don't even remember what I got. I know there was a cotton shirt made from canvas, like the $5 cotton shirts that you'd be better off to sand a board than wear. I know there was a shirt involved and probably like a $5 gift certificate to Wendy's. I don't remember what he said. I just remember the way I felt. Because there was just, he was so proud, and I think probably, here's this 18-year-old kid that he took a chance on, and he was excited about it, and this was all working out. And then, not long after that, I quit that job and, was doing the end of senior year kind of summer thing. And then the following fall, I ended up not going to college, and I went and was working for Coca-Cola. And I was a what do they call, a merchandiser, which basically meant you went to the grocery stores and filled the shelves full of all the Coke products. And I loved working Chris's store. It was weird, but it felt like going home, like back to this guy who I knew was respectable, I knew was hard charging, but somehow he liked me and there was this mutual respect. And then about a year later, when Teresa and I got married, I don't even remember, so that says something, like I invited him to our wedding, and then I remember he showed up. I remember seeing him at our wedding ceremony. And then the night we got married, I was 21, she was 20. We were broke beyond broke. We were college students. We didn't know necessarily what we were doing. So literally, we knew we wanted to go to Denver for our honeymoon. We knew we were going to drive her 1986 Volkswagen Golf that overheated every 200 miles to Denver for our honeymoon. We had no idea what we were going to do because we didn't have any money. So I literally remember sitting in our hotel room that night, opening cards, shamelessly going, okay, we got to count the money because what we get, this is what we have on our honeymoon. And I still remember opening Chris's card, and there was a $50 bill in there. And there's just like, whoa. So who's that person for you? That upon reflection, you look back and you go, they pulled me in a direction that I'm not sure I would have went without them. Maybe it's even a parent, but who are they? And I think the question that I want to ask this morning, and if it's the only question you hear, I think our time would be well spent. If it's the only thing you think about God in all of 2019, I think it would be an okay thing, and it's this. How does God see you? Is God like that person who genuinely likes you? Love is kind of its own separate conversation. He has to love you, right? Kind of like your parents have to love you. He likes you. And he sees good things in you. And he believes in you, and he's trying to pull you forward. But is he like that person, somebody who's for you, but not necessarily going to do it for you? Like, he likes you, and he's willing to do more than his part. But more than that, you know that he likes you. Or is he the curmudgeon who mostly thinks you're a dismal failure, who generally expects you to fail, who doesn't like you, in fact, doesn't like very many of us except for a couple, and that's because you read your Bible every day at the exact same time, and you memorize, and you do all this stuff. Who is God? And how does he see you? And really the question I want to ask this morning then is, how does he see our journey towards faith? Is it one where he's pulling us forward, believing and hoping and doing his part to help us have more and more confidence in him? Or is he one where he is perpetually disappointed, suspicious, austere, and a little bit mad about it? I ask that because there's a particular story in the Gospel of Luke that it just jumped off the page to me this week, and it was in some ways the perfect timing because I was trying to figure out how we were going to piece all this together. But there's this story towards the end of Luke's Gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these 4 books that are really designed to give us the framework of Jesus' life. They're not biographies, but they give us the most that we know about Jesus and the way he conducted his life. And Luke, he tells a story towards the end. Now, the context is the Last Supper. It's if you've ever been to a church where they celebrated communion, we're going to do that next week. That's where we take this from. But from a Jewish perspective, and they were all very Jewish, what they were celebrating was Passover. And we know that Passover, even today, is among the, if not the most important days on the Jewish calendar. And the part about Passover that's so important is that on Passover, they're celebrating the day that God liberated them from bondage in Egypt. We explored last spring that perhaps the reason Jesus centered his death around that feast was because he didn't have this didactic lecture to explain what the cross meant. He had a meal. He had a story. He had a picture, because what it celebrates is the day that God liberated them from an oppressor that they were incapable of liberating themselves from, which is for me, and we don't have to agree on this, this is for me, quite frankly, why the cross is less and less about a God who was otherwise ticked off and someone had to pay, and so Jesus paid so we can like you again. To me, the story in context is less about that than it is a God whose creation was enslaved by a power that they couldn't get themselves out of, and somehow Jesus' death defeated death, and evil lost that day. And so the setting of this story is all the formalities happen. Remember, the way they did this, in case you didn't know, was they didn't have tables and chairs. Like the scene was this. So much more Eastern, almost Asian, food in the middle, guys in a circle, on an elbow, kind of doing this thing. And so they're at the stage where the tryptophan is kicked in and they're all kind of tired and they've done the meal. And these little side conversations have sprung up. And one of the side conversations, kind of like, you hear your kids do this and you're like, they don't think I hear this. I hear all this, but I can't tell them I hear this, or else next time I won't hear this. This side conversation springs up, and it's about who's the greatest. Now, the reason they're having that conversation is because they're convinced that what's about to happen is Jesus is about to kick some butt and reestablish the throne and reestablish the Davidic dynasty. So whatever you understand about Jesus, it's important that we understand that's not the way they understood it. They didn't understand how, but they were expecting someone to kick Rome out, to put up a literal throne in a literal kingdom and lead like a literal king would be expected to lead. So they're debating who's going to be the VP and who's going to be the Secretary of State and who has to be the ambassador to Canada. Like, that's kind of what they're trying to figure out. It's like, how is all this going to land? And Jesus hears it, and he turns, and I don't, it's weird. I assume that Peter was at the center of this conversation based upon what happens here, but the text doesn't tell us. But Jesus, there's this little tiny exchange that happens that it reminds me. Now I can't remember his name. There was an old desert father that he talked about contemplation. And the way he understood contemplation wasn't this mystical thing where we sit there and do this esoteric stuff. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. It wasn't this new age thing. For him, contemplation was reading the gospel story and putting yourself in the scene, smelling the food, understanding what's going on there. That contemplation was just getting inside the story. And there's a couple verses here when I think if we practice that, there's some profound stuff going on here. Jesus turns to Simon. So I just gave you the context. And he says, Simon, Simon. Remember that, so Peter, Simon, don't get thrown off by that. Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. Now, there's lots of different ways that wheat was sifted, but obviously the working metaphor there is there's a separation. One way was that they would have these pits, these kind of big, where they would quarry them out of the solid rock. They would throw all the wheat down in the bottom of this thing. They'd kind of stomp around a little bit, but ultimately what they'd do is wait for a breezy day, and they would take pitchforks, and they would throw it up in the air. And of course, the kernels have weight, so they would drop down, and all of the grassy stuff, the chaff, all that stuff would blow away in the breeze. So it's a semi-violent process. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. Now, there's all kinds of questions raised there, and I have them too about Satan and how he interacts and evil and all those different things. But it's this next sentence that I think bears our attention. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you've turned back, strengthen your brothers. It's an interesting comment, I think. I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. You know what my first response to that was when I was paying attention to it more recently? Well, if you want it for him, why don't you just do it? He's God, right? Like, if God wants Peter's faith to prevail, why doesn't he just pull his wand out and do his abracadabra kind of thing and make sure Peter had enough faith? Which exposes that this God in this narrative and the claims of the people about this God throughout history are different than the Greek ideas. In fact, one of the parallels that stood out to me this week was that this God tends to be really, really hard on things like magic in this story, and sometimes that's created all kinds of, you may, like Harry Potter, and we've created some of these conversations that I don't think are really the point. I don't think the point is you can or can't read Harry Potter, but the point is this, that this God doesn't do it that way. Why? Because magic it theoretically or actually, it overrides the decision-making capacity of the other person, right? If I wave a wand at you and I can make something happen, I do that despite both your effort and potentially your will. And I wonder if however this God does things, it sure seems, doesn't it, that one of the themes is he does almost nothing without the willing participation of you, of me, of people. And apparently that applies to faith, because he's looking at Peter going, Peter, things are about to get really hard, and I really want you to prevail. But I'm not just going to wave a wand. I'm going to pray. But I'm not just going to do it for you, which raises this question for me of what if that is how faith works? What if God is like Chris White? Like that coach, like that teacher, like that parent, like that neighbor, like that parole officer, like that whoever that person was who pulled you forward, he eagerly believes in you and wills for you to become a person who has more and more confidence in him. And he's willing to do a lot of work to make things happen in that direction, but you also have some work to do. I mean, just consider this song we've been looking at. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. I mean, think about that statement. And I get a little confused here. I haven't solved this riddle of how this all goes with what childlike faith is, but I operate on the assumption that David wrote that line long after he defeated Goliath, long after he became the darling of the empire and the most decorated soldier, long after he was anointed the next king, long after the existing king spent several years chasing after him, falsely accusing him, trying to kill him, long after he lost one of his sons to an early death, long after he made some really terrible mistakes like committing adultery, long after David had experienced a lot of life, I assume David wrote this line, the Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. It's a confident statement, isn't it? But what if it's one that he can make after having stepped out? He did the chemo thing. He did the divorce thing. He did the AA thing. He did the work, and he saw God come alongside and do the work. I mean, let's look at the way this continues. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. I mean, these are statements of reflection, aren't they? Aren't these statements from people who they've seen life? They've fought for their faith. They've battled. And they're reflecting. And to me, I wonder if part of the reminder of Psalm 23 is the importance of gratitude, of remembering, of reflecting. Because there's jobs you almost took, and people you almost married, and houses you almost bought, and places you almost moved to, and degrees you almost applied for. And there's diseases that you did prevail over. And there's loss that you did experience, and there's budget crises that you did have to work through, and there were times where it was hit or miss whether or not your business was going to make it. And I wonder if part of the faith component that God has for us involves the art of looking back. You know, one of the most strong threads in all the Old Testament is this thread of remember, remember, remember. I caught myself this week thinking a lot about the conversation that ensued for us around this decision to go from 3 gatherings down to 2. And for me, that started happening about a year ago. And then several weeks in, I started kind of toying with the idea with the staff and then the council. And I really struggled to find the words. And all conventional wisdom around us was saying it would be a terrible mistake. And you all wouldn't be okay scooting to your left. And you wouldn't like being in a room that's 95% full. And there were all these reasons not to do it. And now, if I'm not careful, I just live because, I mean, frankly, I think it's gone exceptionally well. Our kids' ministry is stronger than it's ever been because our leaders aren't so strung out. We're not so thin in the number of volunteers we have. When I see ushers and greeters and all of you who work and make coffee, there's a lightness to things. It feels like we've gotten back to a get to, not a have to, when it comes to being an owner. You know, 33% of our seats, you would think that would be 33% of our giving, but that's not been the case. We're down just a tick. And frankly, the staff energy, the creativity that's happened is, to me, it wins the argument. The quality of the staff's lives are better for sure, but so are, like, we've scattered better this year, in my opinion, than we have for years. More engaged on those levels. And that was part of the conversation is, do we want to become a religious institution that just churns out services and then is exhausted for the other 6 days? Or do we want to be this people who really gathers and scatters? There's no way we'd be thinking about doing Easter in the Kleffner barn. There's just no doubt in my mind, because it's created the creative space, dinner for 8, creative space to kind of think of new things and have new ideas. What if Jesus is looking at Peter going, I want your faith to grow. Like, I think you have the makeup to prevail. Because isn't that one of the voices you hear the most? Like, you're a poser, you're a fake. Anytime you step out of what you think someone with faith would do, nobody's harder on you than you, right? And Jesus is going, you can do this. You can prevail through this season. Your confidence in me can grow. But what if Jesus, frankly, a good parent, is going, I want this for you, but you're going to have to show up. There's work you're going to have to do. I think another way to say this is, what if Jesus, what if he's more interested in who you become than what your faith does? Because that's easy, right? We can get really, really focused on, what is my faith doing? What if God is far more interested in who you're becoming? There's a story that impacted me years ago from Dave Ramsey, speaking of FPU in his class. And by the way, if you're at all struggling financially, I couldn't encourage you to jump into that, as vulnerable as it would be. I just couldn't encourage you enough. But he told this story where he was at like a drugstore or a grocery store at some point, but he'd given the checker a $20 bill, and he was supposed to get $3 and some change back. But she made a mistake and gave him $13 and some change back. And this was so formative for me when I heard this in my 20s, because the way he processed it, and it sounds a little braggadocious, but it wasn't at the time, the way he processed it, he said, I had to decide in that moment whether my integrity was worth $10. Like, whether or not I was willing to trade my integrity for a $10 bill. And he went on to kind of recount that, and he said, and frankly, when I do my taxes, I'm deciding whether my integrity is worth a $10,000 bill. But he's on to something that I think Jesus is getting at here with Peter as they're sitting around this table. He's going, Peter, who you become is what I get from your life. Like what if what God gets from your life isn't the number of services or the number of people you lead to the Lord or the number of verses you memorize? What if it's who you become, your character? And what if what you get from your life is who you become? And what if God is looking at you going, I'd love to develop that deeper, but we have to work together on this because I'm not the God of the magic wand. See, we have this rhetoric, don't we? I know I'm guilty of it myself, that the American theology is that you can become any person you want because eventually you die, and if there is an afterlife, then there's this like car wash thing you go through, and whatever character you've developed that isn't good for this afterlife gets expunged from your being, and there's a new memory chip placed inside of you, and you become the person that is supposed to be in that afterlife. Problem with that is there's nothing like it in the New Testament. The New Testament says all kinds of weird things. Jesus, in fact, in this story says things like, and you're gonna sit on thrones and be leaders over people. That for Jesus, it sure seemed like his belief was whatever life after death looks like, the point of this life is the character we develop in preparation for that, and so what you do is less important than who you become. Well, what if what Jesus is doing is looking at Peter, kind of like a good parent who's trying to teach their kid finances or helping them to get motivated to do something, who's going, man, I'm with you. Kind of like Chris White going, I hired you. I see something, but you got work to do. We have to work together on this. I got invited out our family did to a Chinese New Year celebration last Monday, and so we were driving to the Yacht Sun in East Helena. And if you've not eaten at the Yacht Sun, then you're missing out on one of Helena's best kept secrets, quite frankly. So we're driving out there, and I don't drive towards Walmart very often. In fact, I take I won't say that. But there's this billboard, and you've probably seen it. I've seen it. I wasn't thinking of it, but one of my boys does that thing that you do when you're bored in a car where he was just reading stuff out loud. And it happened, he read that billboard, and when he read it, I turned and looked at it, and he just said, where are you going, heaven or hell? 1-888-555 and this phone number. And I wonder, is that what Jesus was really focused on, was where? Like, was his primary emphasis on where are you going, at the risk of trivializing some of those things? My impression, my opinion, we don't have to agree on this either, is that his focus was who? That our confidence would be in him. Not the where, not the what, the who. And what if Jesus is looking at Peter going, Peter, this thing's just getting started. And I know that you don't think you have very much faith, but in fact, in Peter's case, he felt like he had too much faith. But there's some stuff happening, and I just want you to know, Peter, when you look in the mirror and all your hair is gone, when you're standing in the waiting room of the funeral and you don't think you can go through with this, when life gets really hard, hey, Peter, I just want you to know you can do it. And I'm with you. And I'm praying for you. But you have to step forward in this. Dallas Willard suggests that there's a continuum of faith that really has 3 phases to it. None of them better or worse than the other. Well, that's not true. All of them are stages we have to pass through, but he says we don't all make it to all the stages. Dallas Willard suggests that the first stage of faith is what he calls propriety faith. Propriety faith would be this way of saying it's the moral faith. It's I do good and God blesses me, and therefore I do good because I want to be blessed. And I don't do good when I do bad, God curses me. It's a version of faith that he says is likely to be most of our beginning places. He points to Job. There's a story in the Old Testament about a guy who had a successful business and a great family, and everything was going on, and he was respected spiritually and theologically by his peers. And then there's this weird exchange that happens between evil and God, and evil persuades him that if Job's life was more difficult, his faith would fail. And so things happen. His barns fall over, his business fails. Death and grief and loss is introduced into existence. His own health is taken from him. There's no respect. He's got some of his best friends telling him that he's believing wrong. Everything he thought he knew about God is suddenly not making sense. It's what Dallas Willard calls a faith of desperation. And Willard's point would be, you can go to that next slide, would be that to get to the Psalm 23 faith, the road goes through desperation. It's Job. Eventually, he says to God, though you slay me, I will trust you. It's gritty, it's honest, it accuses God of things, it questions God about things, it knows less than it used to know, but it clings to this reality that the who is still good. And what Dallas Willard says is if we're willing to do the work, we end up at this place of a faith of sufficiency. See, he says that's what's going on with David. He has a faith that knew desperation, that's emerged into something more, and that has enough track record to go, yeah, God, you are good. And that's independent of my circumstances. You know, as they're leaving there, Peter, Jesus, the guys, they get up. They go to the Mount of Olives. And watch what happens. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, pray that you will not fall into temptation. What's that? Well, it's just like the Lord's Prayer. What's going on there? It's God, I'm just going to tell you, my faith is kind of weak, and it's not as developed as I think, and I don't know that I could take very much, so please, that's what the Lord's Prayer is all about. God, please don't send me more than my faith can handle, and I'm trusting God that together we can prevail through whatever it is that comes my way. So let me ask you, what is it? What's the thing? What's the circumstance? What's the hurt? What's the opportunity? And is it possible that the Peter Jesus story is also your story? That God's not naive to the pain. He's not naive to the distraction of the opportunity. That he's very much with you. That like your Chris White, he's going, you can do this. What is it? And what if faith is something that grows not just by talking about it, but by stepping into the stuff God brings along our way? I'd like to pray for you, and then we're going to sing our way out. God, Lord, to me, it's a refreshing thought to think that you're as committed to and engaged in our faith and our confidence in you as we are, probably more so. And God, the shame that comes with even stepping out as a faith-filled person is so prevalent. Thanks, God, that you don't see us perhaps the way we see ourselves, that you don't talk to us perhaps the way we talk to ourselves, that you're healthier than that, you're more secure than that. Thanks, God, that your commitment is to who we're becoming. And thanks, God, for this community of people that is collectively and individually eagerly wondering about you and trying to grow in you. God, would you help us have a Psalm 23 kind of faith? We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.